In today's episode, we're going to talk about the ducking stool. It's titled Fredericksburg's Ducking Stool for Scandalous Women. Have you ever heard of a ducking stool? It's not something that's really well known today. I don't even think it's really talked about very much. But it was an absurd contraption that was designed specifically to help scandalous or outwardly critical, overly opinionated women know their place. I have to describe the design of this contraption for you to fully understand where the story is going. So imagine wooden cartwheels. You have a long wooden beam, and at the end of the beam is a seat, also a wooden seat. It's kind of like a seesaw, except there's only a seat on one end. And the other end is used to raise the beam up and down. The wheels were used to cart it around to and from the body of water that you would be taking said overly opinionated woman to be ducked. Basically, a woman would be strapped into this wooden chair at the end of the seesaw beam and would be carted through the town to a body of water. They would then dunk her underneath the water, bring her back up, ask her if she has repented of her sin. Generally, it took a few times because the ducking probably made them even more overly critical and outwardly opinionated. So after several dunks of holding this woman underneath water for 30 seconds each time, if she repented of her sin and pledged to sin no more, then they would either cart her back through the town in her wet clothes for all to see and drop her off at home, or they would have her walk home in her wet clothes, undoubtedly to have deep thinking about what led her to this situation. Hi, this is Sarah, and you're listening to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really. So here's the story of the ducking stool. The ducking stool was originally known as an engine of correction. It has early origins, but was popular in England and America in the 17th and into the early 19th centuries. It was designed for women who were overopinionated, outwardly critical, slanderous, of ill repute, selling spirited liquor without a license, witchcraft, and more. In America, it wasn't used in New England's colonies often, but the South seemed to embrace it at every chance they could. In the name of hypocrisy, gents, let's throw our Southern manners to the wind and submerge us in over-opinionated woman. Surely she won't plot to kill us in our sleep afterwards. She'll be as timid as a partly submerged alligator patiently waiting for its prey. Nope, nothing to worry about here. This was not only humiliating to she who was dunked, but also resulted in deaths. I mean, a test to see if one could hold their breath underwater for 30 seconds was not considered before doling out the sentence. Now, the first ducking stool was ordered in Virginia by the 1662 Virginia General Assembly in Act 5, titled Women Causing Scandalous Suits to be Ducked. It states, whereas oftentimes brabbling women often slander and scandalize their neighbors, for which their poor husbands are often brought into chargeable and cast into great damages. Be it therefore enacted by the authority aforesaid that in actions of slander occasioned by the wife, as aforesaid after judgment passed for the damages, the woman shall be punished by ducking. And if the slander be so enormous as to be adjudged at a greater damage than 500 pounds of tobacco, then the woman to suffer a ducking for each 500 pounds of tobacco adjudged against the husband, if he refused to pay the tobacco. Yes, poor husbandiers whose mouthy wives brought chargeable and vexatious suits against him. Sorry, but my empathy is low in this regard, since he has the option to not pay the tobacco and save his wife from humiliation, hypothermia, and possibly death. The ducking was even more cruel than we imagine today, because people did not bathe often in these times out of fear of sickness. But I do have to offer a smidge of empathy towards the husbands with unusually busybody wives who did nothing but spread slander. In today's world, slander and gossip has become a second language, And we all know plenty of people who have caused a lot of chaos behaving in this way. Perhaps a good ducking. No, never mind. More trouble than it's worth. I digress. Back to the story. So the Colonial Assembly of Maryland in 1663 through 64 passed an act requiring a ducking stool in each county of the colony. Pennsylvania erected one between 1717 and 1720 for scold and drunken women. In 1769, a woman named Mary Conway was ducked in the Delaware River at the end of Market Street Wharf. About 1779, an Anne Mage was also punished. In 1824, Nancy Jarvis was ducked in Philadelphia. Ducking became the law and the official sentence for those brought forth under charges of being a common scold. In 1634, a man from Hunger's Parish in Virginia, which is Northampton County on the eastern shore, wrote to Governor Endicott of Massachusetts giving a detailed account of a woman named Betsy Tucker. Betsy was married to John Tucker and was reported to have used her tongue violently, which resulted in her husband's house and their neighborhood feel uncomfortable. Gasp. She was taken to a nearby pond, no doubt carted through the town to the ducking stool, which they had already used 3 times that past summer. She was fastened by cords in the stool at the end of the lifting arm, and her dress was tied around her feet. They pushed the stool to the end of the pond and dunked her under the water and left her there for 30 seconds. She was resilient and refused to give in until she had been dunked 5 times. At that time, she finally relented, saying, let me go. By God's help, I'll sin no more." They let her go, and she had to walk home in her wet clothes. Approximately around 1699, a woman in Virginia was charged with witchcraft and sentenced to a ducking in the ducking stool. The day her sentence was supposed to be carried out, the weather was very cold, so the magistrate was concerned the woman would get exposure being carted to and from the stool and postponed her sentence. Now I know what you're thinking. Perhaps the action of submerging her in water at freezing temperatures would be injurious to her health. Nope, that was not considered to be a point of concern. And how quickly beliefs can change. The Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the 15th century for claiming to see God. In 1692, the victims of the Salem witch trials were killed for erroneous reports of witchcraft, and their bodies burned post-death to rid the devil. But all this witch needed was a good dunk into the cold water to persuade her to stop her evil ways and hexing her neighbors? Apparently fire was not needed in the first place. Ducking was highly favored contraption and practice for the American colonists across all 13 colonies. The southern colonies were known to have used them more than the northern. We aren't exactly sure why, but the folks in Virginia, including Fredericksburg, had no qualms about submerging their women in the icy waters of the Rappahannock River. Actually, when the northern states were sparing on their duckings, Virginia embraced it and was more than happy to follow what is now the law. In Fredericksburg, 1785, it was ordered that whipping posts, stocks, and ducking stools were erected. The ducking stool in Fredericksburg was located on the banks of the Rappahannock River at the end of Wolf Street. This was also known as the baptizing place, how ironic, and also the public wharf. Today, it is approximately somewhere between the now Riverside Park and Brock's. These events were well attended by the town, who were there to jeer and add to the humiliation. Who could pass up a good time? I mean, what other sources of entertainment were available for a small port town? In 1921, a story was recalled from a grandmother who witnessed the ducking of a woman named Peggy in Fredericksburg. Apparently, Peggy was a known termagant, and one day she was seen tied to a ducking stool contraption, and as she was carted through the streets, she was, quote, polluting the air with her foul oaths. They pushed her to the Rappahannock and submerged her over her head. When she was pulled out, she was even more irate, so they submerged her again. The third time did not, quote, quench the fire of a feminine temper, but a third time seemed to get the point. After a third ducking, they carted her back through the streets, but she was silent. She was probably more in hypothermic shock than repented. In 1921, it was the 250th anniversary parade, held many floats depicting the time in the city. a ducking stool representing 1791, depicting a time where this contraption was used on scandalous women. It was painted green to represent the moss on the Rappahannock River. Mary Jones and Elizabeth Jarvis were identified as ill repute and were in court often. Mary was arrested for selling spirituous liquors and not having a license, and Jarvis was once threatened by ducking if she didn't post bond. In 1930, a paper in Berryville reported to the Washington Star that some records were located that a ducking stool had been constructed using the same model as Fredericksburg. Trendsetter. Now, in 1824, the first woman political interviewer also faced the ducking sentence for becoming a common scold. This is where the early 19th century comes into play. Her story is interesting, and we'll cover more on her in a later episode. But for now, we'll focus on the ducking sentence. Her name was Mrs. Anne Royal, and her husband was a Revolutionary War officer. And when he died, she traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1824 to demand a pension. Unfortunately, her demand was denied. Women without husbands had very little options for income, so you can imagine her denial generated feelings of anger and bitterness. Let's be honest, you'd be too. Instead of going home, wherever that was, and just sulking about it, she decided she'd begin reporting on Washington's politicians. So she was able to buy an old hand press and the battered type font and created a publication she initially called the Washington Paul Pry. A woman editor at this time was rare, let alone a woman who dared to dabble in the political arena. What? A female with enough intellectual wit to be able to converse and write about politics? So she began interviewing every politician that came to Washington. It's not clear if the interview was voluntary or if she hunted them down, but it was reported that if they subscribed to her paper, then she guaranteed the interview would be full of flattery and puff. However, if they did not, that individual would see a column filled with anything but flattery. The politicians considered this to be a, quote, abuse in sheet, referencing to the abusive language describing them in the sheets of the newspaper. She was soon perceived as a terror to these politicians, and eventually they could take no more. She was indicted under the law as a common scold and sentenced to a ducking in the nearby public pond. However, for some reason, she was not ducked, but otherwise fined and imprisoned. In 1884, in Ohio, a woman named Sally Stratton lived near Addison County, and she was charged with being guilty of extreme cruelty to her aging mother and having been instructed to change her behavior. She did not and continued to be unkind. The town had enough and took her to a pond nearby and ducked her several times. She was then released and instructed to fix her behavior, or she would get the punishment repeated. I'm happy to report that she had behaved herself from that time forward. In 1935 in Philadelphia, a couple named Mr. and Mrs. William Miller were arrested as the result of 40 neighbors complaining that they were nuisances and common scolds. They were arrested under the statute of 150 years ago, and the law called for the ducking stool as punishment. Luckily for the Millers, they were born in the 20th century, and that punishment had been out of practice for 100 years, but was still the law. The judge, Howard A. Davis, ruled that the punishment was no longer in practice, but ordered Mrs. Miller to keep the peace and ordered the couple to move 5 miles from their current residence. Now, in 1961, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the first woman attorney general, Ann Alpern, found herself in an interesting position that could have resulted in a sentence of ducking. A woman named Miss Mabel McCombs of Lancaster was arrested on charges of being a common scold brought on by her neighbors in 1961. Let's remember this. If convicted, the law still listed ducking as a punishment, and common scolds was an outdated charge rarely seen at this point. Now, Miss Alpern said she would not prosecute this woman because, quote, a lady who goes around loudly telling other people what she thinks of them is not worse than a man who boasts about himself. She further went on that when a man is a braggart, he is subject to fines and jail. She was not about to sentence a woman to more severe punishment than a man behaving the same way. Plus, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court outlawed ducking in 1825. This set a precedence and also helped the jail warden, since he would have had the task to carry out the ducking, and there wasn't any ducking stools in existence in 1961. Now, the ducking stool story I find to be hilarious. Of course, there were men who were ducked, but as you can see from the General Assembly, it was designed for women. In Virginia, it was designed to keep women quiet and in her place so that she didn't make her neighbors uncomfortable and bring scandal upon the house of her husband. Thankfully, we don't have those today. Although being scandalous and outwardly critical and overly opinionated is still not a good thing. So we should reconsider if we're going to cause issues to our neighbors, friends, and spouses. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Until next time. For more information, visit my blog at rebelliouscorsets.com.